The alien telepath entered the human mind. Seconds later, the council fell silent. My fingers were already trembling before I touched him. I would never admit that to the council. I have spent 41 years building a reputation that does not allow for trembling. Senior telepath, first rank, decorated by 3 separate interstellar bodies for what they call unmatched psionic composure. I have read the minds of dying warlords and laughing children and creatures that had no face and no name, and not once did my hands shake. But the human was looking at me. That was the problem. Every other species, when brought before the High Council of the Galactic Conclave on Ethon Prime, looked at the chamber. They looked at the ceiling, which rises 40 meters in a dome of polished black stone. They looked at the 7 elder seats arranged in a half-circle above the floor, each one occupied by a figure representing a civilization that had been reaching across the stars before most species had learned to count. They looked at the guards. They looked at their restraints. They looked at everything in the room that was not a living being staring directly at them. Marcus Cole looked at me. He had been looking at me since the moment they brought him in, and he had not stopped. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, the color of deep water before a storm. He was 34 years old according to the file they handed me. A cargo pilot. No military background. No political status. No reason, by any measure we had used to select prior subjects, to be the first live human brought before the conclave for formal cognitive evaluation. He had been chosen because he was convenient. His ship had drifted close enough to a monitoring relay that interception was easy. That was all. He was not special. He was not a warrior or a diplomat or a scientist. He was a man who moved goods between stations for a living, and the council had decided that made him a perfect sample. I remember thinking, as I walked across the chamber floor toward him, that I agreed with that assessment. I no longer agree. Arch-Chancellor Drevos had given me my instructions before the session began. Drevos is the oldest member of the current council, a Vethkal elder whose skin has gone from deep amber to pale gold over the 400 years of his service. He speaks slowly because he has learned that patience is the only thing that improves with age. He told me to conduct a standard surface read, emotional range, cognitive capacity, threat classification, bring back numbers. These humans, he said, are curious creatures, biologically fragile, technologically young, but there is something in the long-range behavioral data that the analysts cannot explain, curiosity perhaps, or instability. He folded his long fingers together. You will tell us which. I told him I would have an answer within minutes. I believed that completely. The chamber was full. All 7 council seats were occupied, which happens only during formal evaluations and emergency sessions. Representatives from the Vethkal, the Meyerhan, the Os Collective, the Durath Assembly, and 3 other civilizations that had no simple names in any human language sat above me in silence, watching. They were curious too, though none of them would use that word. They would call it due diligence. I walked up to Marcus Cole and stood in front of him. He was not a large man, medium height, lean from the kind of work that keeps you moving but does not build mass. His hair was dark and cut short, and he had the look of someone who spent more time outdoors than indoors, even in space, which I later learned was because he kept the observation panels on his ship uncovered at all hours. He said he liked to watch the stars move. He was wearing the same clothes they had found him in, gray work trousers, a dark blue jacket with a patch on the shoulder that said something in English I did not bother to translate. His hands were secured to the arms of the chair with soft restraints, which is our standard practice. Not because we expect violence, because subjects sometimes reach for things involuntarily during a reading, and it disturbs the process. He looked at my hands as I raised them, and then he looked back at my face, and he said something. It was in English. The translation unit on my collar processed it in under a second. He said, "Be careful in there." I stopped. In 41 years, no subject had ever said anything like that before a reading. Some subjects speak before a reading. They beg sometimes. They ask questions. They try to explain why they are not a threat or try to convince me not to look at something specific, which never works. A few have tried to threaten me, which is both pointless and sad. One Durath commander, many years ago, simply began singing a low, repetitive song that I believe was a spiritual preparation for what he assumed was his death. No one had ever offered me a warning. And the strange part, the part that settled into me like a stone into still water, was that his voice was not afraid when he said it. He was not warning me because he was frightened of what I might find. He was warning me the way you warn someone who is about to step into a river without knowing how strong the current is. A practical caution. An honest one. I almost asked him what he meant. I did not, because I did not want to show the council that a human's words had given me pause. So I composed my expression into its professional calm, and I placed my fingertips lightly against his temples, and I began. I have a method. Every telepath develops one over time. Mine involves what I think of as a staircase. I descend in stages, moving through the outer layers of thought first, the conscious surface where language lives, and then deeper, where emotion flows without words, and then deeper still, where memory and identity and the architecture of a self begin to reveal their structure. I take careful notes at each level. I have done this so many times that the process is nearly automatic. I descended the first step. I found a thought about coffee. He was thinking about coffee, a specific memory of drinking coffee in a specific place, a small diner somewhere on a planet he called Earth, with rain against the windows and a newspaper spread open on the table, and a feeling of complete, uncomplicated contentment wrapped around the whole memory like warm cloth. I noted it, simple, nostalgic, normal. I descended the second step. I found a woman, not a specific thought about her, but a presence, the way some people carry the people they love with them as a constant background hum rather than a specific image. She had dark hair. He did not know where she was right now. He had not spoken to her in 3 weeks because of the route he was running. He missed her in a way that was not dramatic or painful but simply persistent, like a low note held underneath a conversation. I noted it, emotional attachment, stable, normal. I descended the third step. And I felt the current. It was not what I expected. I had expected depth, because humans have been observed to have rich inner lives. I had not expected this. The emotional architecture beneath the surface was not a collection of chambers, the way most minds are organized, with one feeling in one room and another feeling safely in another. It was all open. Every emotion he carried was present in the same space at the same time, running alongside each other without collision. He was homesick and curious at the same moment. He was tired and energized. He was afraid, yes, genuinely afraid of the chamber and the council and me, but he was also calm, and both things were equally true, and neither one was canceling the other out. I had never read anything like it. I have read the minds of Meyerhin philosophers who achieve states of total inner stillness. I have read OS collective members whose minds are partially shared with dozens of others, and who experience emotion as a group rather than an individual. I have read Durath warriors whose inner life is structured like military formations, emotion ranked and organized and deployed. Every species has its pattern. The human had no pattern I recognized. Or rather, his pattern was one I did not have a name for. He contained everything at once, and it did not break him. That was what I kept returning to as I held my position at the third step, longer than I had held any position in years. It did not break him. A mind that holds contradicting forces in open contact without resolution should fracture. We know this. It is one of the foundational principles of cognitive architecture across all known species. You contain what you can, and you suppress or resolve what you cannot, because the alternative is collapse. He had never resolved any of it. The grief was there alongside the hope. The fear was there alongside the courage. The exhaustion was there alongside the drive to keep moving. He had been carrying all of it, all at once, his entire life, and he had not fractured. He had simply continued. I became aware, distantly, of the silence in the chamber above me. The council was waiting. 7 seconds had passed. My standard readings take between 3 and 5 seconds for a surface evaluation. I was overdue. I should have withdrawn then. I had enough data for a basic report. I could have given Drevos his numbers, however inadequate, and walked away. Instead, I descended to the 4th step. And I found something that I still do not have the right word for in any language I speak. I found the place where Marcus Cole's personal history lived, not memories exactly, but the shape that history had pressed into him. He had lost people, not in a single event, but over time, the ordinary way that humans lose people, and each loss had left a mark. But the marks were not wounds in any way I could recognize. They were more like calluses, thickened places. Points of particular strength, built from particular pain. He was using the weight of what he had survived to move forward, not despite it, because of it. I had read conquerors who fed on the suffering of others. I had read saints, or the nearest equivalent, beings who had found peace through surrender. I had never read anyone who had made fuel out of their own grief and used it to keep going toward something better. I withdrew from the 4th step and found myself standing in the chamber, my hands at my sides, staring at a human cargo pilot who was watching me with those calm gray eyes. My hands were shaking. I looked up at the council. Arch-Chancellor Drevos leaned forward slightly in his elder seat, his pale gold face arranged into an expression of patient expectation. The others were equally still, equally waiting. I opened my mouth to give my report. No words came. In 41 years, standing before the most powerful governing body in this region of the galaxy, I had never been silent when asked to speak. I was silent now. And in the quiet of that enormous chamber, Marcus Cole's voice came from the chair below me, easy and without drama, the way a man speaks when he already knows the answer to the question no one has asked yet. He said, "I did warn you. I have a rule that I developed in my first decade of service. Never return to a mind you have already read without a full night of rest between sessions. The reason is simple. A telepath who re-enters a mind too quickly starts to carry impressions from the first reading into the second, and the contamination makes clean observation impossible. You stop seeing the mind as it is and start seeing the mind as you remember it, and those two things are never the same." I broke that rule the next morning. I returned to the reading chamber before the council reconvened, before the guards had changed shift, before the official record of the day had been opened. I told the attending officer that I needed to conduct a technical verification of my initial readings, which is a real procedure that nobody questions, and they let me in without a second thought. Marcus Cole was exactly where I had left him. They had given him a bed and a meal and apparently a conversation with a translation unit, because he said "good morning" to me in my own language when I walked in, with an accent that was almost correct. I pulled a chair close to his and sat down across from him, not standing over him the way I had the day before, sitting, equal height. I am not certain I could have explained why. "I am going to read you again," I told him. He nodded slowly. "How deep?" That question stopped me. No subject had ever asked how deep. They asked if it would hurt, sometimes, or how long it would take, or what I was looking for. Depth was a technical concept that most species did not even know was relevant to the process. "As far as you will allow," I said, which was also not something I had ever said before. Normally, I do not ask permission. The council's authority grants me access, but sitting across from this man at equal height, it seemed like the right thing to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't have anything to hide. That's not me being brave, it's just true. My life is pretty ordinary. I just think you're going to find it complicated." I told him that was all right. He nodded again and leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, not bracing for something, simply settling. The way you settle when you are about to begin a long journey and you want to be comfortable for it. I placed my fingers at his temples and went in. The staircase opened beneath me the way it had the day before, but this time I did not slow at the upper steps. I moved through the surface thoughts, which today included a quiet half-formed plan to tell a joke to the guard if he got the chance, and I moved through the middle layers, through the woman and the coffee and the persistent background hum of home, and I descended past the point where I had stopped the day before. I went to the fifth step. This is where identity lives, not personality, which is closer to the surface. Identity, the bedrock of what a being understands itself to be. In most minds, this level is very quiet, very still. It is the place a self retreats to when everything else is chaos, and its stability is what allows the rest of the mind to function. For most species, the fifth step is a single clear note, a certainty, an anchor. For Marcus Cole, the fifth step was a conversation. Not a literal conversation, but the structure of it felt like one. Two forces in continuous dialogue with each other, neither one winning, neither one surrendering. I could only understand them in rough translation because they were not thoughts in any conventional sense. They were orientations, directions. One of them said, roughly, that the world is difficult and people disappoint you and things break and nothing lasts. The other said, yes, so. And the first was not silenced by the second. It was not defeated. It was simply answered. And then it raised another point. And the other answered again. And this dialogue had been running, it seemed to me, for as long as Marcus Cole had been conscious, and neither side had ever stopped, and neither side had ever won, and the result of that ongoing argument was not paralysis but motion. He moved forward not because he had resolved his doubt, but because he had decided to move anyway. I stayed at the fifth step for what must have been a long time. I was aware of it as you are aware of time in a dream, as a background fact rather than a pressing concern. I was reading history. Not his personal history. The history that lived in him the way culture lives in a person, absorbed without being chosen, present without being displayed. The history of his species. Humans had a word for what they had been through. Many words, actually, depending on which part of it you were describing. What I found at this level was not a catalog of events, but the emotional residue of survival, compressed across centuries into something that functioned like instinct but operated at a conscious level. They had come to the edge many times, not once or twice, dozens of times, plagues that swept through populations with no warning and no mercy, conflicts that swallowed generations and left the survivors to build from almost nothing, environmental collapse, slow and grinding, that required every cooperative instinct the species could develop just to survive. Natural events that rewrote coastlines and buried cities, and reminded them, over and over, that the planet they lived on did not particularly care whether they continued. And each time, after the edge, they had come back. Not merely survived, rebuilt, often building something different than what they had lost, something that accounted for what they had learned, which meant the catastrophes were not simply tragedies, but also, somehow, lessons. The species had learned to extract knowledge from suffering at a scale and efficiency I had never encountered in any other civilization. More than that, they had institutionalized it. They had built libraries to preserve what they learned. They had developed sciences to predict and prevent future catastrophes. They had created art to process the emotional experience of loss so that it did not disable them but instead became part of a shared identity. They had looked directly at the worst things that had happened to them and decided that those things were worth remembering and understanding and talking about, so that the next generation would not face the same edge unprepared. No species does this completely. Most preserve history in some form, but most also edit it, selecting for records that reflect well on the civilization or serve a political purpose. Humans edit too. I could feel that in the tension present even in this compressed historical residue. But they have also developed, Alongside the editing, a counter-impulse, a commitment to argument, a habit of questioning the official story, a reflex, sometimes irritating to those in authority, to insist that the uncomfortable truth is worth more than the comfortable lie. The counter-impulse did not always win, but it never disappeared. I moved to the sixth step. I had never gone to the sixth step on a first contact evaluation. The sixth step is reserved for deep reads on subjects who have consented in writing, who are in stable conditions, and who are evaluated to be emotionally and cognitively prepared for the exposure that comes with being read at that depth. I had the first condition, roughly. I did not have the others. I went anyway. The sixth step is where capability lies. Not knowledge or skill, which are higher up. Capability, the actual potential of the mind, independent of what it has been trained to do. It is the difference between what a being can do and what it is doing, and the gap between those two things is one of the most important measurements in cognitive evaluation, because a species with a narrow gap is predictable, and a species with a wide gap is not. The gap in Marcus Cole was the widest I had ever seen. He was a cargo pilot. His skills were navigation, minor mechanical repair, basic commercial negotiation, and an apparently deep knowledge of the best food available at various stations across his shipping route. These are real skills. They are not extraordinary ones. But below the skills, at the sixth step, the potential was staggering. Not in a way that was unique to him, I understood that immediately. This was not about Marcus Cole specifically. This was about what his species had built into its members over generations of surviving impossible things. The capacity for pattern recognition, for adaptation, for creative problem solving under pressure, for cooperation and competition simultaneously, for emotional regulation under extreme stress. Not perfect capacity in any of these areas. Deeply flawed in all of them, in fact, in ways that were clearly documented in his own self-awareness. But the capacity was there, waiting, applicable, and far beyond what our standard evaluation tools had predicted for a species at this stage of development. And beneath the capability, at the very bottom of the sixth step, I found what I had almost missed entirely because it was so quiet. It was choice. Not intelligence, not instinct, not the product of culture or training or survival pressure. A clean, deliberate, continuously renewed decision, operating below conscious thought like a root system operates below a tree. He had decided what kind of person to be. He renewed that decision every day without thinking about it, the way lungs renew breath. And the decision itself was not complicated. It was simply, be the kind of person who is worth something to others. That was it. That was the core. The capability, the survival instinct, the complexity, the contradictions, the grief as fuel. All of it was organized around that single quiet commitment. I withdrew. The chamber came back around me like a room you walk back into after standing outside in cold air. Bright, present, immediately demanding. I was on my knees on the floor. I did not know when that had happened. Marcus Cole was leaning forward in the chair as far as his restraints would allow, watching me with an expression that was very clearly concern. Not fear, not triumph, concern. He said, "Hey, are you all right?" And I, senior telepath, first rank, decorated by 3 interstellar bodies for unmatched psionic composure, said nothing for a very long moment. Then I said, "How do you do it?" He seemed to understand what I meant, even though I had not been specific. He sat back. He thought about it seriously, which I appreciated. He could have deflected. He could have made a joke. Instead, he gave the question the weight it deserved. "I don't know if I do," he said. "I just don't stop. There's always a reason to stop. Every person I've ever known has had 100 reasons to stop at some point. But you look at the reason and you look at what's on the other side of it, and most of the time the other side is worth more." He paused. "Most of the time." "And when it is not?" I asked. He looked at his hands resting against the arms of the chair. "Then you wait," he said, That's all, you just wait because it changes. It always changes. I sat on the floor of the reading chamber for a moment longer than was dignified and thought about 41 years of reading minds, and how completely unprepared all of it had left me for this. Then I stood up, straightened my robes, and walked back to the council to give a report that was going to change everything. The chamber was exactly as I had left it. Our Chancellor Drevos sat in his elder seat with the patience of someone who had been waiting for centuries before I was born and expected to wait for centuries after I was gone. The other 6 council members were arranged in their places, still and formal, their various faces conveying the careful blankness of beings who have practiced political neutrality for so long it has become instinct. The restraint chair at the center of the floor was empty. Marcus Cole had been moved to a holding room during the session break. The chamber felt oddly quiet without him. I walked to the center of the floor. I folded my hands in the traditional posture of formal report. I looked up at the 7 most powerful beings in this region of the galaxy, and I felt, for the first time since my appointment to this position, completely uncertain about what I was going to say. Drevos spoke first because he always does. Telepath Velshara, your evaluation has been awaited. A pause that carried all the weight of a much longer sentence. The council is ready. I was not. But I began. Honorable Chancellor, members of the council, I have conducted a standard evaluation and an extended secondary reading on the human subject. I will deliver my findings in the traditional order. I paused. I request in advance that the council allow me to complete my full report before raising questions. What I have found is not well served by interruption. There was a brief murmur among the council members. It is not standard procedure to make such a request. Senior telepaths do not typically need to. Their reports are brief, numerical, and clear. Drevos granted the request with a slight inclination of his head. Cognitive rating, I said. I cannot provide a numerical value. The murmur became more audible. Our cognitive rating scale was developed across contact with 47 species over 4,000 years. It measures processing speed, pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and adaptive response. Marcus Cole registers outside the expected boundaries in all 4 categories, not because he scores low, because the scale was not designed for a mind that runs contradicting processes simultaneously at full capacity. He would appear to score inconsistently depending on which cognitive state he was in at the moment of measurement. The inconsistency is not an error. It is the point. His species is capable of holding opposite mental orientations active at the same time and operating from both. Our scale has no column for that. Silence, it was the kind of silence that has texture to it. I continued. Emotional volatility index. I cannot provide a numerical value for this either. The murmur came back sharper. Myrth of the Vale, the eldest member of the council, leaned slightly forward in her seat. She said nothing, but her attention sharpened in a way that I noticed. The emotional volatility index measures the stability of a subject's emotional state under stress and the degree to which emotional disruption affects rational function. Marcus Cole has a permanently elevated emotional complexity. He carries grief, hope, fear, resolve, humor, and longing as simultaneous, equally active states. Under our model, this should indicate severe instability. Under any model I can construct from what I have observed, it indicates the opposite. He is not volatile. He contains volatility and operates through it. The index assumes that emotional complexity and functional stability are inversely related. In this species, they appear to be directly related. The more they carry, the more capable they become. No one spoke. I counted the silence. 3 seconds, 4, 5. I was glad I had asked not to be interrupted. Threat classification, I said. Now everyone was completely still. I had thought about how to say this for the entire walk from the holding corridor back to the chamber. I had considered softening it. I had decided against that, because softening it would make it easier to dismiss. I cannot classify the human subject as a threat. His intentions, as far as I can read them, are not hostile. His values, which I was able to examine at depth, are organized around a fundamental commitment to being useful to others. He is not here because he wants to be. He is not angry about his situation in a way that translates to danger. He is inconvenienced and curious, and frankly, more interested in the architecture of this building than in any political calculation about his circumstances. A sound from the direction of Drevos's seat that might, in a younger being, have been a snort. However, I said, and the chamber went quiet again, I also cannot classify him as safe in the way we typically mean that word. The human subject represents a species that has survived repeated near-extinction events, developed advanced capabilities under pressure that our contact assessments did not predict, and possesses a cognitive and emotional architecture that our standard frameworks cannot accurately model. That is not the same as hostile intent. It is something more significant. I took a breath. They are unpredictable, not because they are chaotic, because they are adaptable beyond what our models account for. Our models assume that a species at their stage of technological development has certain limitations of perspective and capability. The human subject I have read does not have those limitations, not because he is exceptional, because, as far as I can determine from what I found in him, he is ordinary. He is a common citizen. He moves cargo for a living. And he is ordinary the way that all humans are ordinary. I let that settle. The threat assessment I am filing, I said, is this. Humanity is not a threat to the conclave as it currently stands. But if the conclave makes decisions about humanity based on the models and categories we currently use, we will be making those decisions based on false information. And decisions made on false information become threats on their own. The silence after that was the longest of all of them. It was Myrth who broke it. Her voice was old and dry and very precise. She said, "You are saying our assessment tools failed." "I am saying our assessment tools were not designed for this," I said. "There is a difference. They have served us correctly for every species we have encountered until now. This species is different in ways that the tools cannot capture. I am not criticizing the tools. I am telling the Council that we are looking at something the tools were never meant to measure." Drevos spoke then. His voice was careful in the way that very old beings' voices are careful, weighted with awareness of consequences. "Telepath Velshara, in 41 years of service, you have never failed to produce a classification." "No," I said, "I have not." "And now you stand before us and tell us you cannot classify a single cargo pilot." "I can classify him," I said. "I simply cannot classify him using our existing categories. He is a human. He is therefore a member of a species that has no equivalent in our records. That is my classification. It is not a comfortable one. I believe it is the accurate one." Drevos leaned back. The Council members looked at each other in the way that powerful people look at each other when something has shifted, and they are not yet certain whether to acknowledge it openly. Myrth spoke again. "What do you recommend?" I had been waiting for that question. I had not been certain I would have an answer when it came. "I recommend," I said slowly, "that the conclave not make any formal decision about humanity tonight. I recommend that we first ask the human what he knows." That landed like a stone in still water. "The subject," Drevos said carefully, "is a cargo pilot. What could he tell the Council that?" "He could tell us what humanity already knows about the conclave," I said. The stone hit the bottom. Every Council member who had been leaning back was now leaning forward. The carefully maintained blankness of political neutrality cracked at the edges of several faces simultaneously. I had not planned to say it like that, but I had been holding the fact since the deep read, since the sixth step, since I found in the residue of Marcus Cole's cultural memory a pattern that had taken me far too long to recognize. The long-range monitoring, the carefully maintained distance of human space travel that always stopped just short of conclave territory. The communications protocols that looked, from the outside, like technological limitation, but which, from the inside of a human mind, looked like deliberate restraint. They had been watching us. "How long?" Myrth asked. Her voice was very quiet. "The subject's cultural memory suggests awareness of conclave activity for approximately 11 years, I said. "I cannot confirm whether this is the full period of their observation. I can confirm that the human I read was not surprised to find himself in a conclave facility. He was surprised at the specific details. He was not surprised at the fact." No one spoke. 7 of the most experienced political minds in this region of the galaxy, individuals who had managed crises that reshaped sectors, sat in complete silence. "I will speak with him," I said. "With council permission. A full translated conversation on the record. I believe he will tell us what he knows because I believe he has been waiting to be asked." Drevos looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Proceed." I bowed and walked back out of the chamber. Behind me, the silence continued long after the doors closed. The holding room was smaller than the chamber but more comfortable, which had been a deliberate decision on the part of someone, and I appreciated it. There was a table and 2 chairs and a filtered window that showed a courtyard garden maintained by the facility staff. Marcus Cole was sitting at the table with a cup of something warm, looking out the window. He looked up when I came in. He did not look surprised. "The council sent you," he said. "The council permitted me," I said. "I asked to come." That distinction made him pause. He set down his cup and looked at me more carefully. "That's different," he said. "Yes," I said. I sat down across from him, the same equal height as the reading room. It seemed to matter. For a moment neither of us spoke. The garden outside the window had something that resembled grass but was a softer blue, and whatever passed for birds on this world moved through it in short, unhurried arcs. "I found something," I said. "In the second reading. I wanted to ask you about it directly rather than report it to the council without giving you the chance to explain." "That's fair," he said. "You knew," I said. "Before they brought you here, you already knew what the conclave was." He did not look away and he did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "For how long?" 11 years, give or take. Publicly, I mean. Some people in our government have known longer, but the general awareness, the kind that gets into the culture, the way people know about something without it being in the news all the time, that's about 11 years. "And you said nothing. Your species said nothing." He picked up his cup again, wrapped both hands around it. "What would you have done if we had?" he asked. "If one day humanity just opened a channel and said, 'Hey, we know you're out there,' what would the conclave's response have been?" I thought about that. I thought about our protocols. I thought about what Drevos would have said in a session 11 years ago. "Containment evaluation," I said after a moment. "We would have assessed your technological level, your political stability, and your military capability, and made a decision about how much contact to permit." "Right," he said. "And 11 years ago we had just come through a pretty rough decade, political instability, environmental problems, the kind of things that look bad in an assessment." He shrugged slightly. "We figured it was better to wait." "Wait for what?" "For you to find us," he said. "Because if you found us first, it meant you were curious. And curiosity is harder to close down than caution. We thought curiosity gave us a better shot." I stared at him. "You engineered the conditions of first contact," I said. He made a small expression that was not quite a smile. "We encouraged them," he said. "We made sure our shipping lanes ran where they ran. We made sure one of the routes would drift close enough to one of your monitoring relays eventually. We just didn't control which ship it would be." He looked down at his cup. "Turns out it was me." "And you are not a diplomat," I said. "You are not a scientist or a military officer." "No," he said. "That was also deliberate." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was a long debate about that. Some people wanted to send someone with more training, someone who could manage the situation politically. But the argument that won was that the first impression you got of us shouldn't be our armor. It should be a person. He met my eyes. Just a person. A person who told me to be careful before I read him, I said. A person who had read a lot of accounts of telepath species' first contact in the historical record, he said, and noticed that the species that got classified as low risk were usually the ones the telepaths could read quickly and easily. The ones that took longer to read were always flagged as complicated. He paused. I wasn't trying to scare you. I just didn't want you to be surprised and misread that as danger. I sat with that for a moment. He had known the process well enough to anticipate my experience of it and try to cushion it. A cargo pilot, with no formal training in interstellar diplomacy. What were you hopping for? I asked. When you said you were waiting for a fourth option, what did that mean? He was quiet for a longer time than he had been quiet for anything else. Outside the window, the blue grass moved in whatever served as a breeze in this facility. We've read a lot of species contact scenarios in our own history, he said. Not with other worlds, with each other. Different groups of people, different cultures meeting for the first time, and it almost always goes one of three ways. He held up fingers to count them. 1. The more powerful group ignores the other. 2. The more powerful group tries to use the other. 3. The more powerful group tries to destroy the other because it's scared. He folded his hand back around the cup. We've been all three of those, on both ends. And the fourth option, I said. Equal ground, he said. The other group has something to offer and the more powerful group recognizes it and decides that the thing to do is build something together. He looked at me directly. That's happened too, in our history, not as often as the other three, but enough times to know it's possible. And you believed the conclave was capable of it. He thought about that honestly. I believed some of you were, he said. I didn't know if that would be enough. I thought about the vote I knew was coming, the argument I would need to make, the faces I had seen in the chamber when the silence fell, and the one face that had leaned forward with sharpened attention rather than alarm. I need to go back to the council, I said. I know, he said. I stood. I was at the door before I stopped and turned back. There was something I needed to ask that was not in any official procedure and served no formal purpose, and I asked it anyway. When I was in there, I said, the second time, did you know how deep I went? He considered this. Not exactly, he said, but I could feel when you got to the part that mattered. It's hard to describe, like when someone reads something you wrote and you can tell the moment they actually understand it. He paused. You were down there for a while. Yes, I said. Did you find what you were looking for? I thought about the sixth step, the gap between capability and current use, the quiet, renewable decision at the base of everything. I found more than I was looking for, I said. That is not a complaint. He smiled then, fully, for the first time since I had met him. It changed his face considerably, made him look younger, made him look, I thought, exactly like what he was, an ordinary person who had been given an extraordinary moment and was trying to meet it well. Good luck, he said, in there with the council. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. I walked back toward the chamber. The corridor was long and the lighting was the particular shade of blue that Ethon Prime uses in its official facilities, cool and formal and designed. I had always thought, to remind you of where you were and what was expected of you. I thought about what was expected of me now. And I thought about what Marcus Cole had said about every generation choosing to hold the leash again. Choosing, every day, to be the kind of people worth something to others. I pushed open the chamber doors. The vote was 3-4. I had not expected it to be that close. I had hoped for something more decisive. I had prepared, in the back of my mind, for something more conclusive in the wrong direction. 3-4 for formal first contact was not a mandate. It was barely a majority. It was 4 people in a room of 7 deciding that curiosity was slightly stronger than caution, and the other 3 deciding that caution was very nearly strong enough. Drevos voted for containment. I had expected that. He is consistent, which I respect even when I disagree with it. 2 others voted with him. The Durath representative, whose civilization had been shaped by a first contact experience 300 years ago that had cost them significantly, and the Os collective delegate, who had concerns about predictability that were not unreasonable even if I believed they were based on incomplete information. Myrth voted for contact. She had said in the deliberations only 4 words that I will carry with me for the rest of my career. She said, "We built this better," meaning the conclave, meaning the system of contact and cooperation and mutual recognition that we had spent 4,000 years constructing. She said we had built it to be better than our worst impulses. And she said it quietly, in the tone of someone who is reminding a room of something they already know and have been trying to forget. The other 3 votes came more slowly. 2 members who had served together for decades and had, I learned later, been in private communication during the recess. And 1 member, the youngest of the 7, who had said nothing in the deliberations and then voted yes without explanation. When the result was announced, there was no celebration. There was another silence, different from the ones that had preceded it, heavier, more aware of itself. The silence of 7 beings who understood that they had just made a decision that would have consequences they could not fully predict. I was appointed first liaison to humanity. I accepted, formally, in the official language of the conclave. I was then asked to deliver the news to the human. I walked back down the blue corridor. I was aware of my own footsteps in a way that I normally am not, the sound of them, the particular rhythm, the fact that I was making them. Marcus Cole was still at the table. He had finished his drink and was looking at the window again. He did not look like someone who had spent the last several hours waiting for a decision that would affect the future of his species. He looked like someone who had learned over a long time that waiting is simply one of the things you do, and that it does not require a particular expression. He looked up when I came in. I sat down across from him, equal height. That seemed by now like the only appropriate way to sit. "The council has voted," I said. He waited. 4-3, I said, "for formal first contact." He closed his eyes just for a moment. When he opened them again, they were still that same steady gray, but something had shifted underneath the surface, something that I recognized from the 6th step, from the place where choice lives as a root system below a tree. The decision renewed itself. The commitment recommitted. "Okay," he said, his voice was level. "Okay. I have been appointed first liaison," I said, "to humanity, which means, in practical terms, that the first formal communication between the galactic conclave and Earth passes through me." He nodded slowly. "That's a big job," he said. "It is," I said. "I have been thinking on the walk here about what the first communication should say." "What have you decided?" "I have not decided," I said. "That was why I thought I should speak with you first." I paused. "You know your people better than I do, and you know what they have been waiting for. What should the first thing we say to them be?" He looked at me for a long time. The garden was still outside the window. The blue grass was still, and the bird-like creatures had settled. "Tell them," he said, "that we passed." I thought about that. I thought about what it meant to a species that had stood at so many edges and chosen to continue. The idea of a test, the idea of a result, the idea that patience had been its own kind of answer. "What did you pass?" I asked. "From our perspective, you were not being tested." "From yours, maybe not," he said. "From ours, we were testing ourselves. Every year that we knew about the conclave and chose not to reach out in panic or in aggression was a year we passed. Every year we spent getting our own problems sorted, getting more stable, getting better at taking care of each other. Was a year we passed." He looked out the window. We weren't waiting for you to be ready. We were waiting for us to be ready. I thought about 41 years of reading minds. I thought about the fifth step, about the continuous dialogue between difficulty and continuation. I thought about a species that had turned catastrophe into fuel and silence into preparation. I thought about what it would mean to introduce them to a conclave that had very nearly chosen containment. That had been one vote away from a very different kind of relationship. They should know, I said, that the decision was not unanimous. He looked back at me. Yeah, he said, we figured it probably wouldn't be. That does not concern you. He thought about it the way he thought about everything I had asked him, with the weight it deserved. It makes it more real, he said finally. If it had been easy, I'd have been suspicious. The things that matter are never easy. He looked at his hands again. 3 people in that room decided we were too much of an unknown. That's honest. That's how new things go. What matters is that 4 people decided the unknown was worth meeting. Meyerth, I said, the eldest member of the council, said 4 words in the deliberation that I think were decisive. She said, "We built this better." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to thank her." "I will arrange it," I said. I meant it. I would arrange it. It seemed like exactly the kind of small thing that mattered. The kind of connection that happens at the level of people before it happens at the level of civilizations. We sat in silence for a moment. Not the tense silence of the chamber or the weighted silence of the vote. A comfortable silence. The kind that happens between people who have said the important things and do not feel the need to fill the remaining space with lesser ones. Outside, the bird-like creatures began to move again, crossing the garden in their short, unhurried arcs. "What happens now?" Marcus Cole asked. "Now," I said, "you go home, with a communication device and a contact protocol, and the understanding that the conclave will reach out through official channels within 30 days. Your people will have time to prepare a formal delegation." "And you?" "I begin learning," I said. "Everything I found in the second reading was a start. It is not close to enough." "You could come with me," he said, simply, as a practical suggestion, for the first part at least. If you're going to be the liaison, it would help to actually see where we live. I had not considered that. It was not part of any protocol I had been given. It was also, immediately and obviously, the most sensible thing he had said since I had met him. "I will propose it," I said. "Okay." He stood up then for the first time in hours and stretched his arms above his head in the way of someone whose body has been in one position too long. Entirely ordinary, entirely unimpressed with the extraordinary things that had just happened around him. "For what it's worth," he said, looking down at me, "I think you were the right person for this job." I looked up at him. "I was assigned because I am the most senior telepath," I said. "No," he said. "I mean because you went back for the second reading. You didn't have to do that. You had enough for a report. You went back because you wanted to understand, not just classify." He shrugged. "That's the kind of person you want standing between 2 civilizations meeting for the first time." I have read 10,000 minds. I have found extraordinary things in very ordinary places. I have read conquerors and saints and creatures with no name, and I have filed reports on all of them and moved on to the next assignment. I have never, in 41 years, been changed by a reading the way I was changed by this one. Marcus Cole walked to the door of the holding room and paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at me the way he had looked at me since the moment they brought him in, steady and gray-eyed and entirely present. "Ready," he said. I thought about the staircase, about the 6th step, about the quiet, renewable root of a decision that keeps choosing, every day, to be worth something to others. I stood up. "Yes," I said. And we walked out together into whatever came next.